They say no one ever comes back from Eden 9. No distress signals. No bodies. Just silence. Officially, it was a terraforming failure, one of many lost causes floating in the outer systems. But to those who whispered in backroom halls and classified corridors, Eden 9 wasn't dead. It was watching. A planet designed not for life, but for control. For testing. For erasing mistakes no one wanted to admit existed. When Re Vosque's shuttle was torn from orbit and flung into its atmosphere like a condemned man into a furnace, there were no rescue plans, no protocols. He wasn't a soldier or a spy. He was a mechanic, a quiet man who spoke more to machines than to people. No one expected him to survive. And no one cared. But survival isn't always about strength. Sometimes, it's about choice. And Re chose, from the moment the jungle swallowed his broken body whole, that he would not become just another silence. Eden 9 didn't kill him on impact. It waited. It studied. And Re, battered and breathing, studied it right back. What he found wasn't just monsters in the trees or whispers in the wind. What he found chained and half dead in the dirt was her. She wasn't supposed to be there. She wasn't supposed to be alive. But she was. And when Re Vosque broke her chains, he didn't just free a prisoner. He lit a spark that would burn through the lies of a forgotten world. Because sometimes, all it takes is one person. One unexpected survivor. One man who says, no more. And that's when Eden 9 stopped being the predator. And started becoming prey. They never called it by name in official documents. There was no Eden 9 listed on any public star map, no flagged warnings, no restricted sectors. Just an empty patch of space with nothing to offer, no trade, no minerals, no colonies. But those who had served in covert operations, those who worked in the shadows of corporate militaries and classified directives, they knew the myth. They knew the name whispered like a curse in mess halls and transport ships, spoken only when the doors were sealed shut and the lights were low. Eden 9. A place where people vanished not in flames or impact craters, but in silence. Total erasure. No mayday calls. No black box recoveries. No wreckage. Just the simple truth, no one ever came back. The stories varied. Some claimed it was haunted by the souls of war criminals, others that it was home to ancient alien ruins protected by lethal guardians. But the most common thread was always the same: something lived there, something that didn't want to be found. The few who dared speculate further spoke of the jungle, the way it moved, the way it breathed. As if the planet wasn't just dangerous. It was conscious. Re Vosque had never believed in ghost stories. He believed in torque ratios, fusion coils, and backup power grids. His life was defined by the mechanical, the logical, the knowable. A man who'd grown up in outer belt colonies fixing what others discarded: broken systems, leaky hulls, fried NAV cores. He didn't crave adventure or meaning. He just wanted quiet, the hum of a working engine, and a paycheck that didn't bounce. So when his shuttle was yanked from orbit without warning, its systems scrambled, its engines fried, he didn't think myth. He thought malfunction. He fought with controls that no longer responded, watched his own descent on screens that flickered and died one by one. He felt the heat of atmospheric entry flood the cockpit, smelled burning metal, heard the bones of the ship scream in protest. It wasn't a crash. It was a punishment. When Re regained consciousness, he was upside down, strapped into a ruined chair that no longer belonged to a shuttle, but to a grave. Smoke coiled from exposed panels, sparks danced across the floor. blood matted his hair and clouded his eyes. For a long time, he didn't move. Not because he was afraid. Because the stillness of the jungle around him was too loud. It was like being in a room with something holding its breath, waiting. There was no rescue coming. He knew that. The ship hadn't just fallen, it had been pulled. Something on Eden 9 had reached up and snatched him from space with purpose. There were no beacons, no tracking trails, no functioning comms. It wasn't bad luck. It was orchestration. But Re Vosque didn't panic. He didn't scream. He did what he always did when things fell apart. He crawled from the wreckage, checked what could still be salvaged, and kept moving. Not because he thought he could win. Because he refused to give Eden 9 the satisfaction of breaking him without a fight. The planet was unlike anything he'd ever seen. Lush, thick, saturated with green so deep it was almost blue. But nothing about it felt alive in the way nature usually does. The leaves recoiled when touched. The trees pulsed faintly, like they were breathing. And the ground? It wasn't firm. It gave underfoot, like walking on muscle. Even the air felt wrong. It didn't move with the wind. It watched. And still, removed. He built shelter from his ruined ship, found water by following the hum of the moss, scavenged tools from the broken panels and shaped them into weapons not meant to kill but to warn. He wasn't there to conquer Eden 9. He was there to outlast it. Days blurred together. Time bent in strange ways under a sky that never looked the same 2 nights in a row. And yet, through the fear, through the exhaustion, something within him stayed anchored. Some quiet part of him that refused to disappear. A belief not in gods or myths, but in will. And then, just when the jungle seemed like it might finally swallow him whole, he found her. At first, he thought she was a hallucination, a smear of color against the trees, too humanoid to be safe, too alien to be familiar. She moved like she had no memory of how legs were supposed to work. Her skin was covered in soot and old blood. And chained to her wrist was something that glowed faintly with pulsing, unnatural light. She didn't speak. She didn't beg. She just collapsed at the edge of the clearing and looked at him with eyes too big, too silver, too alive. And Re, the mechanic no one ever chose first for anything, stepped forward and said the words no one else ever had. "I'm not with them." He knelt. He pulled out his tools. And he cut the chain. Because sometimes, it only takes one person to break a myth wide open. Sometimes, the man who fell from the sky isn't just another ghost in the story. He's the one who changes how it ends. It wasn't the kind of crash you survive. Not really. When Re Vosque came down on Eden 9, he didn't just fall, he was torn from the sky, like the planet had reached up with invisible hands and yanked him from orbit in a fit of rage. 1 minute, his shuttle was gliding through the black, routine, and uneventful. The next, every alarm blared in unison, panels glowed red, and gravity spun sideways. The world turned inside out. There was no warning. No system error. No sign of failure. Just a sharp, unseen force that ripped him downward through layers of dense atmosphere, dragging the shuttle like it was being claimed by something personal. Something that didn't just want him to crash, it wanted him to suffer. The descent wasn't fast. It was slow enough to feel every second, every jolt and tear and fracture as the ship was broken apart by heat, friction, and the fury of a planet that didn't forgive trespass. The outer plating peeled away. The hull screamed. Instrument panels blinked in and out like dying fireflies, and when the final surge hit the navigation core, it fried every remaining control. After that, there was only fire and silence. When the impact came, it didn't feel like a landing. It felt like burial. The ship didn't skid. It didn't roll. It sank nose first into the jungle floor, punching through the canopy, uprooting trees that had stood for centuries. Metal split open like bones snapping under pressure. Vines thicker than Re's arm coiled around the wreckage as if trying to hold it down, trying to keep it from escaping, from breathing. And then, for a while, there was nothing. No sound. No movement. No pain. Just the heavy, choking presence of stillness. Re came back slowly. His first sensation was the taste of blood. Coppery. Sharp. Then the sting of smoke in his eyes. Then the ache. Not one wound, but all of them at once, ribs screaming, shoulders bruised, forehead bleeding from a gash that pulsed in rhythm with his heartbeat. He was hanging upside down, the restraints still dug into his chest. The console in front of him was cracked and scorched, leaking small tendrils of smoke. Sparks hissed and popped like distant gunfire. He didn't move right away. There was a moment, a single, crystalline second, where he truly believed he was dead. That this was the afterlife. The silence. The weightlessness. The strangeness of the air. But then the ship creaked. Groaned. Shifted slightly. And he realized with sudden clarity, he was alive. Not unharmed. Not safe. But alive. The release harness jammed the first time he tried it. Then again. On the third attempt, it snapped open and dumped him to the ceiling, now the floor, with a brutal thud that stole the air from his lungs. He lay there for a few seconds, coughing, blinking through the haze. His body was shaking, but not from fear. From the sheer effort of existing. He didn't feel lucky. He felt wrecked. It took him nearly 20 minutes to crawl from the cockpit to the outside. Not because of injury, though those were plenty. But because the shuttle had embedded itself into the ground like a spear. He had to pry open twisted metal, squeeze through mangled support beams, and push his way past heat-warped doors. When he finally fell out into the open air, it didn't feel like escape. It felt like being born into a nightmare. The jungle was dense, humid, and far too quiet. No birds. No insects. No wind. Just green. Endless, watchful green. The sky above shimmered in hues that didn't belong in nature, violets and ambers and sickly gold. The light shifted like oil on water, never quite still. He took stock of what he had. Not much. A pulse pistol that had seen better decades. A comms array with a flickering power cell. A broken heatsink. A ration bar melted from the crash. But more importantly, he had breath. He had time. And that was more than anyone who landed on Eden 9 ever had. Re didn't panic. He didn't cry. He didn't curse the sky. Instead, he started moving. His boots sank slightly into the moss. The ground gave under his steps in a way that felt almost intentional, like it was reacting to him, not supporting him. He walked a slow circle around the wreckage, keeping one hand on the hull for balance. His ribs ached with every breath, his vision swam, but he moved anyway. There was no time to collapse. No one to save him. Every minute was a test. He salvaged what he could, wiring from the control panel, reflective fragments from a ruined sensor, insulation sheets still warm with lingering energy. He fashioned a crude shelter using what remained of the side hull and a fallen tree split by the impact. He used the heat sink to boil water gathered from condensation on the leaves. It tasted like metal and rot. he drank it anyway. By nightfall, he had a fire. Small. Unreliable. But it pushed back the darkness. That's when he knew Eden 9 wasn't just deadly. It was aware. The trees leaned closer when the sun disappeared. The wind didn't blow, but shadows moved. Shapes flickered in the distance, too big for animals, too silent for humans. And the silence deepened, as if the forest itself was holding its breath again, listening for something. He should have been terrified. And he was. But more than that, he was angry. This planet thought it could erase him, like it had done to so many before. But Re Vosque wasn't built to disappear. He was built to endure. And tomorrow, he would start finding a way not just to survive but to fight back. There are forests that grow. Forests that breathe, evolve, and stretch across worlds untouched by civilization. Re Vosque had seen plenty of them during his life on the outer colony's lush wilderness on terraformed moons, genetically modified groves designed for oxygen production, even a few war-torn landscapes trying to reclaim their roots. But nothing, had ever looked at him. Eden 9's jungle didn't behave like any ecosystem he had studied or wandered through. It didn't simply grow. It observed. It calculated. It responded. Every step Re took felt like it echoed through something ancient and alert, something that bent around him not as a backdrop, but as an actor waiting for its cue. He wasn't walking through the jungle. He was being invited in, or perhaps, tested. In the days following his crash, he began to notice the patterns. The way the vines coiled and uncoiled depending on the angle of sunlight. How the leaves didn't rustle in the wind because there was no wind. The way patches of moss would throb beneath his boots, slightly delayed, like a pressure sensor registering contact. No wildlife shrieked or scattered. There were no birds, no chirping insects, no night calls. The silence wasn't natural. It was designed. At first, he thought it might be some form of terraforming failure. Perhaps the bioengineered flora had developed unintended feedback loops, growing overly sensitive to movement and environmental shifts. But then he saw how the vines would retract from his touch, specifically his. Not just brushing away, but pulling back in timed, deliberate intervals. Not fast enough to startle. Not aggressive. Just aware. He tested it. Moved slowly. Changed his pace. Stepped lightly one moment, stomped the next. The jungle adapted. Leaves turned toward him without wind. Thin strands of web-like fungus quivered as he passed, as if excited. One morning, he awoke to find a cluster of glowing spores had grown overnight, in a perfect ring around his shelter. When he touched them, they scattered, rising into the air like a gentle warning. This was not evolution by accident. It was by intent. He wasn't dealing with the forest. He was inside something bigger. Something watching. Re had grown up with machines. He knew systems. Knew when wires were laid in sequence, when energy followed purpose. That same instinct told him this place was a system, organic, maybe alien in origin but unmistakably interconnected. Each part fed into the next. Each movement rippled through unseen networks. The jungle didn't just react. It remembered. He discovered this the hard way. On the third day, after narrowly avoiding a fall into a camouflage sinkhole, he marked the path with a strip of fabric torn from his crash suit. Just a precaution. But when he returned to the spot 12 hours later, the hole was covered again by a smooth carpet of moss. And the fabric was gone. The jungle had cleaned up. Reset the trap. Like it wanted the game to continue. That night, he couldn't sleep. Not because of fear but because of realization. This place wasn't hunting him blindly. It was learning. Adjusting. Testing new variables. It didn't want him dead, not immediately. It wanted to see what he would do next. That changed everything. Re stopped thinking like a survivor and started thinking like a systems engineer. If the jungle was a closed-loop AI, what was its purpose? Defense? Containment? Or was it something worse, a behavioral experiment on a planetary scale? He began laying false trails, placing heat packs to mislead whatever thermal sensors might exist in the deeper flora. Tapping rocks in specific rhythms to see if patterns triggered any environmental shifts. He even constructed a crude spike trap to see if the jungle would dismantle it. It didn't, at least not for 3 days. Then it vanished, along with the tree trunk it had been mounted on. In its place stood a flower he hadn't seen before. Tall. Vibrant. Perfectly symmetrical. Re laughed out loud. Not because it was funny, but because it confirmed the truth. The jungle wasn't just aware of him. It was interacting with him. What he couldn't figure out was why. What did it want? Observation. Data. Submission. Then came the whispers. At first, he dismissed them as hallucinations, fragments of exhausted thoughts given shape in the dark. But as they continued, always just beyond hearing range, always at night, he began to recognize patterns. Not words, but cadence. A rhythm. Like a language trying to be born. The vines would twitch in time with the sounds. The leaves would shudder, not in wind, but in resonance. The jungle was speaking. And it wasn't speaking to itself. That terrified him more than any beast ever could. Because it meant that this wasn't just nature gone wrong. It was communication. Intent. Consciousness. The jungle was alive and it wanted something from him. He didn't know what. Not yet. But he knew one thing: if it was watching, he'd make damn sure it saw more than a victim. He reinforced his shelter. Created redundancies. Used scraps of the crashed shuttle to shield against environmental shifts. When he slept, it was with one eye half open and a weapon in hand. He didn't speak to it, not out loud. But he thought his actions might be answer enough. You want to test me? Fine. Watch me last. Watch me build. Watch me turn this prison into something you don't understand. Because Re Vosque was no longer walking through the jungle. He was walking against it. And no forest, no matter how alive, was going to decide who he became. He saw her before he fully understood what he was looking at. It was the way the light caught on something that wasn't bark, not stone, not plant, something that gleamed faintly beneath the shadows of 2 massive, black-rooted trees. Re had been moving through the underbrush carefully, quietly, scanning for anything salvageable, when the jungle's unnatural silence shifted around him. The hairs on his neck rose. Something was near. Something different. At first, he thought it might be another trap, like the moss-covered pit or the heat-triggered spore bursts he'd narrowly escaped the day before. But this wasn't an ambush. It wasn't even hidden. It was wrong. The shape slumped at the base of the tree was humanoid barely. Its posture was broken, hunched low, one arm stretched behind it unnaturally, dragging something metallic that scraped softly against the ground. As Re crept closer, hard hammering, he realized it wasn't just metal. It was a chain. Thick, smooth, almost organic in design, and pulsing faintly with what looked like power, except the signature was dead, flickering like a memory of something once living. The figure wasn't moving. He raised his pistol, not out of aggression but caution. Then the figure stirred. Slowly, with the fragile effort of someone who hadn't moved freely in a long time. It shifted forward an inch, and Re's breath caught. The figure was a woman, or at least, she had once been. Her skin was a dull, iridescent blue, masked by grime and blood. Her hair hung in a tangled sheet, black as space, streaked with soot. Her arm, the one bound by the chain, trembled with the weight of dragging it. When she collapsed at the edge of the clearing, it wasn't theatrical. It was final. Re didn't move right away. Every story he'd heard about Eden 9 screamed at him, trap, bioweapons, lures, hallucinations, psychological breakdowns. This was a place designed to exploit instinct, to make you feel when you should be thinking. But this wasn't a hallucination. It wasn't bait. This was a person. He stepped into the clearing slowly, lowering his weapon, voice steady but cautious. "I'm not with them," he said. The woman flinched at the sound, tried to crawl backward, but the chain caught her short. Her lips moved dry, cracked, but no sound came out at first. Then, hoarse, broken, "They didn't forget me. They left me." It wasn't a plea. It was a statement. The kind people make after running out of reasons to scream. Re knelt beside her, carefully, slowly. She didn't resist. Her eyes large, silver, far too luminous for a human, locked onto his face as if trying to decide whether he was real. Whether she should hope. "I'm going to cut the chain," he said. She didn't respond. But she didn't stop him either. That was permission enough. The chain was like nothing he'd seen, some hybrid of metal and biology, fused at the wrist through time or tech he couldn't identify. It took nearly 5 minutes to break through it, his multi-tool sparking dangerously near her skin. She didn't scream. Didn't cry. Just watched him with shallow breaths, as though trying not to collapse before it was done. When the final link snapped, the chain fell into the dirt with a muted thud. She stared at her freed wrist like it didn't belong to her anymore. Re sat back on his heels, panting. "What's your name?" She blinked, the question catching her off guard. Then, after a long pause, "Neva. I'm Re-pilot. Supply runner. I crashed here." Something flickered across her expression, surprise, maybe, or disbelief. "You weren't supposed to come," she said. "No," he muttered. "I figured that out." He handed her a pouch of water. She took it with both hands, sipped slowly, carefully, like her body wasn't sure what to do with something so simple. Up close, her skin was stunning deep blue, yes, but threaded with faint bioluminescent veins that glowed beneath the grime. Her features were sharp, angular, but delicate. Her collarbone bore bruises. Her arms had scars. She had no shoes. No supplies. Just a chain, and a silence that screamed louder than any beast on this world. He offered her a ration bar. She sniffed it, took a small bite, chewed slowly. Her hands trembled, but she didn't drop it. "Can you walk?" he asked. She tried. Her legs buckled immediately. Re caught her before she hit the ground. "I can carry you." "No," she whispered. "Just, help me stand." He moved slowly, letting her lean on him without pressure. Her arm slid over his shoulder. Her fingers clenched his shirt as if afraid he might vanish. But she stood. They didn't speak again as he guided her through the jungle. The trees seemed to lean closer, the shadows moving with slow deliberation. Something shifted behind them, too big to be a predator, too quiet to be a human. Neither of them looked back. They didn't have to. By the time they reached the wreckage of Re's shuttle, the last of the daylight had vanished. He wrapped a thermal blanket around her and let her settle onto a stack of cargo crates. She sat in silence, eyes tracking every movement he made. She didn't offer answers. He didn't ask questions. Not yet. But when he handed her a second blanket, she met his gaze and held it for a heartbeat longer than before. Not trust. Not comfort. But the beginning of something fragile. She was supposed to die out there. Chained. Forgotten. Meant to be a message, or worse, a warning. But Re Vosque didn't leave people behind. Not even here. And in the eyes of the girl the jungle tried to erase, he saw a reflection of something he thought he'd lost, the choice to be human, even when the world tried to take it from you. They didn't speak much in the first days. There were too many unspoken things between them: trauma, exhaustion, the kind of bone-deep weariness that comes from being betrayed by the very system that once gave you a name and a purpose. Re Vosque was a stranger to Neva, just as she was a mystery to him. And yet, in the quiet between moments of fear and survival, something began to form, something beyond necessity. Re didn't ask how long she'd been out there. He didn't press her for details about the chain, or what exactly she had done to earn that kind of punishment. He just handed her water when she needed it, watched her sleep in fits and starts, and built what little shelter he could from the twisted wreckage of his shuttle. Neva, in turn, offered no thanks. Not because she was ungrateful, but because she hadn't spoken to another living soul in what felt like forever. Gratitude was a foreign language, and survival didn't leave room for sentiment. But trust is a strange thing. It doesn't always come through words. Sometimes it's built in silence. In the way she watched his back as he scouted for supplies. In the way he gave her the last of the power cell heat without hesitation. In the way they moved not as allies, not yet, but no longer alone. It was Re who spoke first about the jungle, about the way it seemed to think. About how it didn't just react, it adjusted. He explained how the vines shifted when he approached, how the moss recoiled, how the air carried whispers that weren't wind. She didn't laugh. She didn't call him paranoid. She just nodded, slowly, like someone who'd been waiting for someone else to see it too. Then, one night, beneath the canopy of a sky that never quite showed the same stars twice, she finally told him the truth. Eden 9 wasn't a terraforming project gone wrong. It was a test site, private, unregulated, buried beneath layers of false records and government silence. Funded by private defense corporations under the guise of bioengineering research, the planet had been seeded with predators not born, but made. Creatures designed to adapt to every threat, to learn from failure, to evolve past human defenses. And into that jungle, they threw people. Subjects. Test cases. Not criminals. Not soldiers. Just, the unwanted. The unnoticed. The expendable. Neva had been part of the team that monitored outcomes. A behavioral analyst specializing in organism-environment interaction. Her job had been to observe. To collect data. But she'd seen too much. Seen children classified as non-viable test variables. Seen the way failure didn't mean recalibration, but disposal. She'd broken protocol once. Just once. Freed a child from a cage and opened a door that wasn't supposed to open. The child didn't survive. But she had. Barely. She didn't know who had given the order. Only that she woke up in the forest, chained, marked for data collection like the rest. Meant to die quietly, eaten or broken. Forgotten. But she didn't die. She adapted. And now, sitting beside Re in the ruins of his ship, with the chain that once bound her lying discarded at their feet, she whispered the words that would define everything that came next. They can't keep hiding this. At first, Re didn't know what to say. He wasn't a fighter. He wasn't an activist or a hero. He fixed broken things. Machines. Wiring. Cooling units. He wasn't made for this kind of war. But then he looked at her. At the scars. The wrists still raw where the chain had dug deep. The eyes that held grief and fire in equal measure. And he realized something simple, something quiet. He was already in the war. The only question now was whether he would fight it. They began to work not just to survive, but to reveal. Neva taught him how the observation nodes worked, where old comm towers had been buried beneath the shifting forest. Re taught her how to scavenge energy from a half-dead power core and reroute it through a salvaged NAV relay. Together, they hunted for data caches, used defunct equipment to record transmission logs, encoded footage into corrupted frequencies. They didn't have a ship. They didn't have a way off-world. But they had truth. And they had fire. Rebuilt a beacon, not a distress signal, but a broadcast. It didn't cry for help. It told a story. Of experiments. Of people turned into statistics. Of creatures built for war and turned loose to feed. He used every scrap of tech he had, every wire and every coil, powered by solar arrays rigged to glow just long enough to reach beyond the canopy. And Neva? She recorded her voice over the transmission. Calm. Measured. Sharp as glass. My name is Neva Keelan. I was part of the Eden 9 directive. I was a witness. I was a prisoner. I am still alive. And you deserve to know why. They knew it wouldn't last. The system would react. Scramble their frequencies. Send something worse than drones. But it didn't matter. Because in a jungle designed to erase the unworthy, two strangers had done the impossible. They had survived. They had seen each other. And together, they had given the truth a signal strong enough to echo across the stars. They were never supposed to last this long. Not Re. Not Neva. Not anyone marked by Eden 9. The jungle had its patterns. Its rules. You landed. You ran. You screamed. And eventually, you vanished. A clean system. No remains. No signals. Just silence. It was designed to make you disappear without leaving behind even the idea of resistance. That was its power erasure. Total, surgical, merciless. But Re Vosque was never good at following systems. And Neva Keelan had already broken hers long before the jungle wrapped its roots around her fate. They had no reinforcements. No allies. No timelines. Only each other, and a growing defiance that burned hotter with every day they survived. The world around them wanted them to dissolve into dirt, into fear, into forgotten names and forgotten screams. But there is something relentless about human will, something illogical, inefficient, and wildly unpredictable. They were supposed to fall apart. Instead, they adapted. Re was the first to say it out loud. It happened one night, after a narrow escape from one of the jungle's newer creations, a hybrid predator with infrared tracking and muscle plating thick enough to shrug off plasma bursts. They'd left it behind with a trail of fire and a half-melted fuel cell. Sitting in the half-buried ruins of an old research outpost, surrounded by darkness and the faint hum of dying tech, Re looked over at Neva and said quietly, "I don't think I know how to give up." Neva didn't laugh. She didn't smile. She just nodded slowly, like she understood that truth wasn't bravado. It was admission. A confession of something that had kept them both breathing when logic said they shouldn't be. The jungle wasn't just trying to kill them anymore. It was reacting to them. Sending smarter things. Quieter things. Trying to predict their moves and adapt faster than they could. And that was the second truth they discovered. Eden 9 didn't fear humans because of their strength. It feared them because of their refusal to become part of the design. Humanity, in all its flawed, chaotic glory, couldn't be contained by systems meant to control behavior. You couldn't graph stubbornness. You couldn't predict kindness. You couldn't suppress the moment one person chose to save another, even when it made no sense to do so. Neva had once been part of the system. She'd written protocols, designed tracking software, watched data streams that monitored heart rates, panic levels, behavioral decline. She knew what the algorithms expected from people like them: collapse, rage, regression, eventually, surrender. But Re didn't collapse. And she, despite everything, had never surrendered. That anomaly was the one thing Eden 9 had never calculated. They became a glitch in its code. Every old station they reclaimed, every broken terminal they rewired, every whisper of truth they sent through stolen frequencies, each one was a fracture in the lie that Eden 9 was unstoppable. Recarved old power lines into traps. Built sound-emitting decoys that lured predators away. He modified a shattered drone into a mobile relay unit, bouncing encrypted signals beyond the jungle's reach. Neva hacked into buried security systems, reactivated perimeter sensors, and accessed logs that had been sealed for years. They didn't just hide. They pushed back. They exposed the infrastructure. They stole the language. And slowly, quietly, they began to rewrite the story. It wasn't about escape anymore. It was about remembrance. About planting seeds of truth in a place designed to erase memory. Eden 9 had silenced so many. But not them. Not this time. The moment they triggered a response from orbit, they knew they'd gone too far to turn back. A ship arrived without warning, sleek, silent, military. But it wasn't there to rescue. It was there to contain. Retrieval protocol. Standard procedure. Wipe the site. Eliminate variables. They watched the gunship descend from their latest hideout, a ridgeline overlooking the old comm array. Its engines roared like judgment. Soldiers poured out with clean armor and cold eyes, moving like people who had done this before and never been questioned. Neva crouched beside Re, hands tightening around the flare gun she'd modified into an anti-sensor burst. "They're not here to help," she said. "I know," he answered. There was no time for speeches. No time for regret. So they moved. They used the jungle's aggression against them, luring the soldiers into predator zones, setting off bio-triggers that turned the environment into chaos. Trees fell. Ground cracked. Something huge roared from beneath the earth. But in the middle of it all, Re and Neva didn't run. They activated the last broadcast beacon they had built. The final message. Not encrypted. Not hidden. Just truth, loud and raw and undeniable. Images flickered into the sky. Footage of the chained. Audio of the test logs. Names. Faces. The ones who never made it out. The ones who never had the chance. And Neva's voice, clear and resolute, rang through the static. We were never lost. We were erased. And we remember. The gunship turned. It fired. The ridge exploded behind them as they dove for cover. But it didn't matter. The message had gone out. The silence had been broken. Eden 9 couldn't unhear it. In the aftermath, as fire swept across the treetops and the jungle howled in confusion, Re and Neva climbed higher, toward a clearing lit by the wreckage's glow. They were bloodied, bruised, barely holding together. But they were still standing. And for the first time, the stars looked back without judgment. Because when humanity refuses to be erased, even the most perfect systems fall apart. Not because they are weak but because they were never built to contain something as unquantifiable, as relentless, as a human heart that refuses to stop beating. No one ever escaped Eden 9 by luck. The planet wasn't designed to let people leave. It was designed to swallow them whole, body and memory alike. To ensure that by the time the screaming stopped, there was no evidence anyone had ever been there at all. It didn't just bury bodies, it erased stories. And in a system built to perfect erasure, survival had to become more than an act of will. It had to become a form of engineering. By the time Re and Neva realized that their transmissions had drawn orbiting attention, it was already too late to remain invisible. The corporate retrieval squad had arrived, not to rescue, but to clean. To contain. To erase the last threads of data that they had dragged out of the mud and roots of a planet that never forgave trespass. The predators were closing in from the south. The soldiers from the north. The window between those two advancing fronts was narrow, maybe non-existent. But Re had never trusted windows. He trusted tools. And Neva trusted the patterns beneath the chaos. They didn't look at each other and plan. They moved. As if some shared current of understanding had already passed between them in every sleepless night, every hastily assembled trap, every whispered exchange beneath a canopy of listening trees. They both knew the truth now: escape wasn't something waiting on the horizon. It had to be built with their own hands, from the wreckage of everything that had tried to break them. The remains of Re's shuttle had long since been stripped to bare ribs. Panels, wires, even the fuel conduits had been scavenged for heat, power, light. But scattered across the jungle in makeshift camps and abandoned substations were other parts. Rusted solar wings from downed drones. A stabilizer fin from a forgotten satellite station. Struts from a broken communications relay. Pieces that, alone, meant nothing. But together, they might become a chance. Neva had once designed guidance software for orbital drones. She could still remember the logic of lift, trajectory, glide slope. She found an old schematic in a corrupted archive, buried beneath military layers meant to hide failed prototype escape systems. The file was half broken. It didn't matter. She filled in the rest with what she knew and with what Re could build. They carried pieces for 3 days across a shifting terrain that wanted them dead. They were hunted every hour. The jungle shifted its routes to confuse their paths. The predators adapted to their movements. The weather itself seemed to conspire to slow them. Acid mist. Spores that numbed the skin. Temperature spikes that made their tools sweat with condensation and short circuit. But they kept moving. Because there was no version of survival that waited for them to rest. The glider wasn't beautiful. It was asymmetrical, bolted at odd angles, held together with twisted copper and sealing foam that barely held its form in the thick humidity. The cockpit was a seat welded from cargo crate panels. The wings were patched from tarp and solar film. It shouldn't have flown. It wasn't supposed to fly. But nothing about Re and Neva was supposed to exist anymore. They built it on the edge of a cliff, a high ridge overlooking the canyon where the jungle was thinnest. Below was danger. Above was chance. There was no engine. Just slope and silence and momentum. Enough, maybe, to lift them beyond the predators, beyond the soldiers, beyond the planet's reach. The final night before the launch, they didn't sleep. They sat in silence by the base of the glider, wrapped in the thermal blanket they had shared through every storm and every wound. Re held the makeshift ignition trigger in his hands, staring at it like it held a promise he wasn't sure he deserved. "What if it fails?" he asked. Neva looked at him. Her face was thinner now. Her hair still wild. But her eyes had never been more focused. "Then we fall free." It wasn't hope. It was something stronger. Acceptance. Of risk. Of cost. Of freedom that had to be paid for, not granted. They launched at dawn. The sky was thick with fog, heavy with spores. The jungle whispered beneath them, almost like it knew. Almost like it could feel the betrayal. Re pushed the glider forward, sprinting with what strength he had left. Neva steadied the wings. And when the wind caught, when the lift finally found its hold under the tattered solar panels, they rose not far, not high, but enough. Enough to outrun the reach of claws. Enough to pass over the retrieval zone before the soldiers could lock weapons. Enough to see, for the first time, the entire stretch of Eden 9 in a single, breathless moment, a planet both magnificent and monstrous, blooming with life that had forgotten how to care for its creators. The glider held for 12 minutes. Just long enough to reach the edge of the impact valley where an old launch platform had once stood. Just long enough to crash through a canopy of brittle branches and come skidding down into a clearing still marked with faded stripes and fractured pavement. Re was unconscious for 6 minutes. When he woke, Neva was already dragging him clear, already scanning for new threats. Already building again. They didn't escape Eden 9 that day. Not yet. But they built the map. They laid the coordinates. They triggered the distress signal. They gave the orbiting ships a reason to come closer and enough evidence to make sure someone was listening. Because escape wasn't mercy. It wasn't offered. It was made. Forged from broken metal and stolen code and sleepless nights spent daring to believe in something more than survival. They didn't wait for the system to save them. They outbuilt it. They outran it. They made it irrelevant. And in doing so, they did the one thing Eden 9 was never meant to allow. They became unforgettable. It didn't happen all at once. It never does. Trust doesn't spark like fire. It doesn't rush in like a storm. It builds the way roots do, slow, unseen at first, but powerful beneath the surface. Re and Neva were never meant to trust each other. They had come from different corners of the same nightmare. He, a man pulled from orbit by a planet that wanted him gone. She, a ghost of the program that had built that same world, used it, and then tried to discard her within it. On paper, they should have been enemies. Or strangers passing in the ruins. But Eden 9 had its own laws. And none of them respected paper. It started in silence, long before either of them named it. The first time Neva woke up screaming from a dream she didn't want to remember, Re didn't speak. He just handed her water, sat a few feet away, and stared into the dark as if standing watch against ghosts that couldn't be shot or trapped. She didn't thank him. But she didn't pull away, either. Later, when Re sliced open his palm on a fractured panel trying to salvage wire from the wreckage, she didn't hesitate. She took his hand, cleaned the wound, and wrapped it with the quiet efficiency of someone who had done this too many times before. He didn't flinch under her touch. But when her fingers brushed his, there was a flicker of something that hadn't existed between them before. Not affection. Recognition. They didn't speak of it. Didn't call it anything. But it grew. In the way they moved together instinctively, side by side, covering blind spots and reading each other's choices without the need for words. In the way Re started building tools that fit her grip. Not because she asked, but because he noticed the tension in her fingers when her old blade didn't sit right. In the way Neva stopped avoiding eye contact, and started watching him like she was memorizing the shape of his presence. They didn't plan it. They didn't want it. But slowly, the space between them became something else. Something no longer defined by necessity or survival. Something alive. One evening, after escaping a patrol drone that had swept too close to their signal decoy, they found shelter in the hollow of a tree whose roots stretched wider than a shuttle bay. The night was quiet, unnaturally so. Re worked silently by firelight, tuning a salvaged emitter. Neva sat across from him, legs pulled close, her eyes reflecting the flicker of orange. She broke the silence first. "I thought you would hurt me." He didn't look up. "When?" "After you cut the chain." He paused. "Set the tool down." "I know. I'd seen what people become out here. Hunger, fear, power. They turn kindness into currency. Trade safety for control. I thought you would want something in return. I'm not that kind of man." "I know that now," she said quietly. "But it scared me, how long it took to believe it." He finally met her gaze. There was no accusation in her voice. Only the weight of someone who had lived too long without being able to trust anything soft. They held that silence between them, and for the first time, it didn't feel heavy. It felt honest. Later that night, as rain began to fall through the cracks in the canopy above, she sat beside him. Not close enough to lean on him, but close enough to let their shoulders touch. She didn't ask. He didn't move away. That became their rhythm. A quiet pull that never demanded but never stopped growing. Re had never been good at connection. Machines were simpler. Predictable. Honest in their failures. But Neva, she was something else. She was a contradiction. Hardened and fragile. Guarded and kind. She rarely spoke about the things she had done, or seen, or lost, but in the quiet moments, he could read the pain written in the tension of her shoulders and the way she stared too long at nothing. He didn't ask her to open up. Instead, he gave her space and stayed anyway. Neva, for all her analytical training and behavioral expertise, could not explain why she kept watching Re Vosque. Maybe it was the way he spoke only when it mattered. Or the way he repaired broken tech with the reverence she hadn't seen since before Eden 9 took everything from her. Or maybe it was because he was the only person who didn't see her as a tool, a traitor, or a mistake. He just saw her. And in his presence, for the first time in so long, she began to remember who she had been before the chain, before the jungle, before silence. One night, as they camped beside the remains of the original observation post, Re handed her something wrapped in cloth. A simple necklace. At first, she didn't understand. Then she saw what it was. A link of the chain he had broken from her wrist. Polished. Softened. Hanging beside a shard of metal etched with coordinates the place they first met. "Chains mean something different now," he said. She didn't cry. Not in front of him. but her hands trembled as she fastened it around her neck. That was the night she kissed him. Not out of desperation or gratitude, but because in that moment, with the firelight flickering and the jungle quiet for once, she finally believed she was something more than a survivor. She was human again. And so was he. They still fought. Still ran. Still planned like every day might be their last. But something had changed. They were no longer just surviving Eden 9. They were building something in spite of it. Something that the jungle couldn't consume. Something the system could never erase. Two prisoners, reshaped by fear, scarred by silence, had become partners. And in each other, they had found the one thing the architects of Eden 9 never accounted for. Love. Not the fragile kind, but the kind forged under pressure. Tempered by fire. Quiet. Steady. Unbreakable. And as long as they had that, the jungle would never win. It began not with a roar, but with a signal. A flicker of light. A weak transmission. The sound of static breaking across abandoned frequencies. For years, Eden 9 had been a whisper in the dark, a myth buried beneath bureaucratic indifference and corporate red tape. It was spoken of in rumors and dismissed by officials as a failed terraforming attempt, a classified project no longer in operation. But the truth had always been deeper, more insidious. Eden 9 wasn't a forgotten experiment. It was a prison without walls, a graveyard for the unwanted, the silenced, the inconvenient. And now, for the first time, it was being heard. Re and Neva didn't plan to shake the stars. That had never been the goal. All they wanted was to survive, to claw back their voices from the silence. But survival, for people like them, had become an act of defiance. And telling the truth raw and unfiltered had become the only weapon they had left. It started with fragments. A stolen frequency from a downed drone. A relay tower buried beneath roots and vines, still humming with the ghost of power. Re rebuilt it with whatever he could find: solar arrays from their glider, a cracked NAV core wired to bypass security firewalls, cables scavenged from the wreckage of forgotten outposts. Neva reprogrammed the transmission protocols, overriding the old corporate encryptions with her own signature, one they would recognize, and more importantly, one they couldn't deny. They didn't encrypt the message. There was no point. If it reached the wrong hands, they'd be hunted. If it reached no one, they'd be forgotten anyway. But if it reached the right ears, if someone was still listening beyond the veil of sanitized reports and sealed files, it might matter. It might force a reckoning. The message wasn't polished. It wasn't edited or rehearsed. It was truth, bleeding and breathless. Neva sat before the terminal, eyes glassy but voice steady. The camera feed flickered, capturing her just as she was filthy, bruised, skin marked by the chain Re had broken weeks before. But her gaze was unshakable. She didn't speak like a victim. She spoke like a witness. My name is Neva Keelan. I was part of the Eden Directive. I designed the systems. I watched the experiments. And I was left to die for refusing to be part of it. She paused, not for effect, but to steady herself. They called it adaptive behavioral testing. Said it was for science. For security. They took people, some volunteers, some not, and dropped them into the jungle to observe their reactions to stress, fear, pain. They watched us run. Watched us break. Watched us die. They said it was controlled. But it wasn't. It was cruelty, dressed in protocol. It was execution, masked as research. She looked directly into the lens. You don't have to believe me. You can dismiss this transmission as a glitch, a fabrication. But we've attached logs, video, audio, names, coordinates. We found the bones beneath the trees. We found the cages. We found the data you tried to bury. Re's voice came next, quieter, but no less firm. I'm Re Vosque. Civilian. Supply runner. I was pulled out of orbit by Eden's gravity well. My ship wasn't supposed to land. It was brought down. What I saw here, what I've lived through, shouldn't exist. No one builds a planet like this by accident. And no one survives it without scars. The final footage was stitched together from everything they'd recorded. Chained bodies. Predators that looked like they were born in nightmares. Corporate logs with redacted names and unredacted results. Children listed as test groups. Civilians marked as expendable. The last image was the chain, resting in the dirt beside Re's foot. A symbol. A question. What kind of world lets this happen? And then the signal pulsed into space. There was no countdown. No flare. No cinematic crescendo. Just the message, steady and strong, climbing its way through atmospheric interference, past the veil of silence Eden 9 had used to cloak itself for so long. They didn't wait to see if it worked. They ran. They knew what was coming. Cleanup crews. Drones. Erasure teams trained to wipe out the remains of secrets too dangerous to leave behind. But they ran anyway, with the hope that someone, somewhere, had heard. That someone had felt the tremor in their chest when the transmission cut through their feed. And someone had. At first, it was just noise. An anomaly flagged by a board technician on a listening post near the edge of regulated space. But then came the metadata the signature Neva had embedded, the coordinates tied to a planet that officially didn't exist. And then the silence broke for real. Because truth is contagious. Within hours, the message was decrypted, duplicated, and leaked. First to small networks. Then to whistleblower platforms. Then to every major channel in the outer colonies. People didn't look away. Because they saw themselves in the faces of the lost. They saw children. Partners. Friends. They saw what could have happened to them if they'd been born to the wrong district, signed the wrong form, asked the wrong question. The media called it the Eden Files. Investigations were reopened. Executives vanished. Probes were launched. And most importantly, Eden 9 was no longer a secret. Neva and Re watched the fallout from the edge of a hidden moon, tucked beneath a sky that no longer felt like a prison ceiling. They didn't celebrate. They didn't smile. They just sat together on the rooftop of the shelter Re had built, holding hands in the dark, watching as a once silent world was finally forced to speak. They hadn't just escaped. They had forced the universe to listen. And in doing so, they had proven something undeniable. Even the smallest signal, born in the quiet of suffering, can echo across the stars when spoken with truth. The thing about endings is they are rarely what they seem. From a distance, Eden 9 looked like a closed chapter. A planet sealed off by scandal, wrapped in classified files, and locked behind shame. The broadcasts had gone out. The truth had shaken the void. Investigations were launched. Names were named. And the world, for a fleeting moment, turned its gaze toward the darkness it had once ignored. But for Re Vosque and Neva, the end was not a line in the sand. It was a door. One that didn't slam shut with finality but cracked open just wide enough to let in something strange and fragile. A future. They had every reason to disappear. Every system around them still bent toward control. Though Eden 9 was exposed, the machinery that birthed it remained. Silenced, perhaps, but not dismantled. Institutions don't fall from truth alone. It takes time, pressure, memory. And memory is fragile. That's why they didn't vanish. That's why they stayed visible. 6 months after the last transmission lit up the outer systems, Re and Neva were living on a quiet moon in the Andari belt. No cities. No surveillance towers. Just wind and stars and silence that didn't want to consume them. It was the kind of place where nothing needed to be proven. Nothing needed to be earned. A place where healing wasn't a mission but a rhythm, slow, quiet, steady. Rebuilt their home from salvaged ship panels and concrete mix hauled by hand. It wasn't elegant, but it was solid, honest. The walls were marked by the dents of trial and error, and every joint spoke of a man who had once made his living fixing the things others gave up on. Neva tended the land. What little there was. She repurposed abandoned greenhouse equipment, tested the soil with old tech she reprogrammed from a broken drone. She grew food that tasted of dust and promise. And each day, when the suns dipped below the horizon, she sat on the rooftop beneath the stars, a mug of nutrient tea in her hands, her necklace catching the last gold of the fading light, the piece of the chain Re had cut, and the scrap of his shuttle etched with the coordinates of where they met. They didn't talk about Eden 9 often. Not because they were avoiding it, but because they carried it in everything they did. In the way they looked over their shoulders when they heard an engine hum in the sky. In the way Re still kept tools within reach at all times. In the way Neva's hand would sometimes drift to her wrist, where the scar remained. Trauma doesn't leave. It settles. But so does love. And this, whatever it was between them, had become something deeper than survival. It had become a way of seeing the world. A way of choosing each other, again and again, even when the silence came back. Even when the old fear whispered that none of it could last. One evening, Re found her in the garden, sitting with dirt under her nails and a quiet look in her eyes. "I've been thinking," she said. "Dangerous," he teased, setting down the part he was holding. "I want to build more than just a life with you. I want to build a legacy. Something that lives beyond us." He didn't ask what she meant. He just listened. "Eden 9 was a wound," she continued, "but it taught us something. About what's broken. About what needs to change. There are others out there, systems like it. Planets with different names. People still buried in silence." Re looked at her for a long time. Then he nodded. "Then we start small. We build a network. We teach others how to speak. How to survive. How to push back." Neva smiled. Not the tired kind. The real kind. The kind she hadn't worn since before she'd been left to die. That's how it began. Not with protests. Not with riots. But with blueprints drawn in chalk. With a signal relay patched together from scrap. With stories shared across encrypted channels to strangers who thought they were alone. They called it the Signal Project. A decentralized net of survivors, engineers, analysts, runaways, and dreamers. People who had seen the edge of systems that grind down the soul and chose, somehow, to come back from it. They didn't fight governments. They fought forgetfulness. They archived memories, coded testimonials, published instructions on how to dismantle surveillance tech and forge paths in hostile terrain. They planted gardens in soil meant for war. They taught trust in places where trust had been a death sentence. Re became the builder again. Not of machines, but of pathways. Safe houses. Quiet places. Hope stitched with wire and sweat. Neva became the voice. Not shouting, but steady. A guide. A mentor. A reminder that sometimes, survival is the loudest revolution. They never went back to Eden 9. There was nothing left to return to. The jungle had gone silent. The creatures, without orders, without stimulus, had turned on each other. The forest, once a living net of terror, had begun to decay. The planet was dying not because of exposure, but because its purpose had ended. And maybe that was the point. When systems built on pain lose their power, they wither. Not fast. But eventually. Re and Neva didn't wait for the world to applaud them. They weren't heroes in the way stories like to paint them. They were two broken people who chose to love when the universe told them it was safer to forget. And in that choice, they wrote a new ending. One that wasn't about escape or vengeance. One that was quiet, intentional, human. Because in the end, Eden 9 wasn't their grave. It was their beginning.